Hey guys, welcome back to new video, and in this video we're gonna learn about Koin Dependency Injection framework. Now the question is, what do you mean by dependency injection? The main purpose of dependency injection is to provide dependencies, and in Android dependency means objects. So the main purpose of dependency injection are to provide class objects, that's all. So in order to do this, we have various kind of frameworks like Dagger-Hilt framework or Koin Dependency Injection framework. So in this particular video, I'm going to tell you everything that you should know about Koin Dependency Injection framework. So without wasting any time, let's get started. So first thing first, you need few dependencies. So go to your build.kts file, and here I have already added all the dependencies. By the way, you can get this project from my GitHub repository, link present in the description box. On the top, we require a few plugins. So we have here serialization plugin and the KSP plugin. In your root label, you can add these two plugins, I mean the serialization and the KSP. Sync your project, and yes, you are good to go. So let's begin with our project. Now in this project, I'm going to create a fake authentication feature so that for you it's very easy to understand. So first thing first, I'm going to create few packages because I want to use here clean architecture. So due to that reason, we have three different layers. We have data, then we have domain, and lastly our presentation layer, which I will call it view. Now in our domain, I'm going to create a repository interface, which is auth repository, and in this we have two functions. Suspend function get a user name, return type of this thing is string. Next we have get address. Again, the return type of this function is string. It's time to implement this. So in our data layer, I'm going to create a class, and the class name is auth repo impl. This will eventually uses our interface to provide their implementation. So in the get username, I'm going to first introduce some delay, and lastly return my name, which is Himanshu. And here in the address, first I'm going to provide 1 second delay, and after that I'm going to return address. Okay, so this is my repository implementation. Now in our domain layer, we do have one package for our use cases, so let's create that. Now in this use case, we have two different use cases. So first use case is for get username use case. Now in this class, I'm going to create here operator function naming invoke, use here flow builder, and type of this flow is string. Now in this we need our repository. So in our constructor, I'm gonna use it auth repository, emit here auth repository dot get username. If anything goes wrong, you can use catch operator to catch the exceptions. Simply emit the message that you receive. So I'm gonna call this name from it to throwable, and use this throwable its localized message. Execute this flow on dispatcher.io. So this is my first use case. Next we have one more use case to fetch the address. So get address use case. Now in this class, I'm gonna use my auth repository. Again, we have here operator function invoke, use here flow builder, type of this thing is again string, emit auth repository dot get address. If anything goes wrong, catch the exception, convert the name from it to throwable, emit the throwable localized message, and execute this flow on dispatcher.io. Okay, so now we do have our two different use cases. It's time to create our view model. So in our view package, I'm going to create a class, and the class name is auth view model. Now this class eventually extend view model in order to inherit all the properties of view model. Now requirement of this view model is our use cases. So get username use case. Next we have get address use case. And on the bottom, in order to hold our state, we need one data class naming UI state. Now in this first parameter is loading, which will eventually use to tell us the loading state. Next the actual data, or in this case we have two different data. So for that, first we have a name, type is string, and initialize this thing with null. Next we have address, type is string, and initialize this thing with null. Lastly, in order to tackle the error state, we have here error message. By default, its value is empty string. Here I'm gonna create one more UI state, mutable state flow. Initialize this thing with UI state. Just below to it, we have one more UI state which actually used to expose our UI state in the composables. So UI state convert this thing in as state flow so that no one can mutate it. Alright, so it's time create a few function. First function is get user name. I'm using here get username use case. On start, I'm gonna simply use my UI state and update its value with UI state is loading true. Next we have on each emission, and in this on each we will actually receive the result. Now we do have result. It's time to update our UI state. UI state we have here name parameters, so simply update it with result. And lastly, if anything goes wrong, you can catch those things over here. UI state, update it, UI state. In error, you can use the message. Pass it over here. Convert this thing into a string because in the catch we will receive the throwable. So simply pass that message in a form of a string. And launch your flow in ViewModel scope. So this is my first function. Next function is get address. Get address use case. So here I'm using on each, and in its on each we'll receive our result. UI state in place of address will use result. Okay. Next catch. So if anything goes wrong, we'll receive the message. So simply grab this message and update our UI state in place of error, message.toString, and simply launch this thing in our ViewModel scope. So this is for our ViewModel. So we are pretty much done with our basic setup. Now it's time to use this thing in our composable. But before that, let's introduce this Koin Dependency Injection framework in our project. So for that, in order to begin with the initial setup, we'll create base application class. So let's do that. Now this base application class is actually extends our application. Now in our application, we do have our application lifecycle like on create. In this on create, use start Koin and attach your Android context. This at the rate base application. Now this is our application context. Alright, so we are pretty much done with the initial setup of base application. It's time to register this base application in our manifest. But before that, let me just rename it so that it's good. Okay, now it's time to use in our manifest. So go to your manifest and in plus of name, you can use base application. Alright, so now we are pretty much done with the initial setup of Koin DI framework in our project. It's time to introduce all of the other things. So let's start with our data layer. Now in this data layer, if you see, we have here auth repository implementation, which eventually provides the implementation for our auth repository. In our use cases, we do use this thing. Basically, our use case will depend on auth repository. So if you want to create an object of use case, get address use case, then on that case, if your dependency injection will provide auth repository, then it is very easy for us to create it. So let's see how we can do it. So for that, we have here modules. Now in our data layer, I'm going to create a class and the class name is data module. Okay, this is a file and this file has one variable. So we have here module DSL. Now in the module, you can tell the way of creating your objects, because our Koin DI doesn't know how to create your object, custom object basically. Due to that reason, we create modules, and in this module we can show him the way to show how to create objects that we want to inject. So first let's create a factory. Now we have here factory, we have here single, we have here scope. Now factory means when you want this object, it will create a new object for you. Single means if you want the same object again and again, it will never create new object. It will create an object only one time. And if in future, if you want that object, it will simply return the instance of that object. It will never create new one. Now scope is something that we will discuss later. So just remove it from here. I'm using here factory. Okay. Now I want to give the implementation for my auth repository. So auth repository implementation is given by our auth repository implementation class. That's it. Now when you want to inject auth repository in your use case, it will simply come here and see, okay, this is a way of creating auth repository implementation. So if he knew, he will simply inject this thing in your use cases. Okay, so this is a very simple way of using Koin dependency injection framework or any dependency injection. Okay, so now in the domain, I'm going to create one more module. This is a file, and this time I'm going to create here domain module with the help of module DSL. Now in this time, we are going to provide our use cases, because in our authentication view model, we do require these two use cases, but our Koin dependency injection framework doesn't know how to create it. So let's tell him the way to create it. So here I'm going to create a factory. Now this time I will return get username use case, and the requirement of this use case is authentication repository. Now our Koin DI will knew how to create auth repository implementation. So simply use here get. This get will find the auth repository creation logic. It will create it and inject it over here. Now here we do have two different things, like we have here get, we have here inject. Now the main difference between get and inject is get is used when you want to initialize your variable or object eagerly, and inject is used when you want to initialize your object lazily. So usually in the modules we use get. Okay, so now our Koin DI will know how to create get username use case. Similarly, let's create one more get address use case and inject our auth repository in it. Now our Koin dependency injection knew how to create get address use case. Cool. And one more thing, here we have one more module type, which is a lazy module. Now again, the main difference between module DSL and lazy module DSL are lazy module will never initialize eagerly. Once you access it, it will then allocate memory. But if you are using here module, it is eagerly initialize. So if you want to use lazy module, you can do it very easily. Alright, so we are pretty much done with our domain module. Now let's begin with our authentication view model, or you can say presentation layer. Now in this presentation layer, we have our view model. So let's create one module which actually used to create this view model. I mean, to show Koin DI way how to create it. So for that, let's create a file, and the file name is UI module. Use here module DSL, and in this we have a view model. Now view model is a function that you can use to create Android specific component, which is view model. Auth view model, and requirement of this thing is two different use case. So our Koin will know how to create it, so it's very easy for us. Alright, so now here we have three different modules: data, domain, and UI module. It's time to register them in our Koin dependency injection framework. So for that, go to base application, and here in its start Koin, you can use modules. First, you can register your data module, then your domain module, and lastly UI module. And one more thing, I showed you how you can use lazy module. So if you want to attach here lazy module, for that you can use lazy module and simply pass your lazy module. And also in its lazy module, if let's say I'm passing a data module, next you can also use a dispatcher, on which dispatcher you want to load this. So let's say I'm using here dispatcher.io, so it will eventually load your module lazily when you access it for the first time on dispatcher.io. Basically it uses background thread. Remove it for a time being, we don't need it. Alright, so we are pretty much done with it. Now it's time to use everything in our user interface. Now go to your main activity, and here I'm using everything. So first thing first, we do need our view model. So wall view model, initialize this view model with get view model function. Now this view model function is coming from our Koin DI. You can mention the type, so auth view model, and next I'm gonna use UI state, collect as state which is attached to our composable lifecycle. Now it's time to use everything. So in our scaffold, I'm gonna use it. So if our UI state is loading is true, on that case, I'm gonna create a box having modifier fill max size. Its content alignment is on the center. Circular progress indicator. Similarly, if our UI state error is not blank, on that case, I'm using the same thing. basically copy this stuff, paste in here. In place of circular progress indicator, we'll use text. Message is UI state error. Okay, lastly the success state. So here we have two different variable, a name and address. So corresponding to that, we will check whether we receive the success state or not. So for that, we have a UI state. In this we have a name. So if it is not null, on that case I'm simply using my greeting composable, and let's use our name over here. So this is for the name. Alright, so yeah, we are pretty much done. Alright, so now it's time to execute our application. Alright, so we have a problem here, and the problem in our authentication view model, I haven't called these two functions. So let's do that. In the init block, I'm first using my get username. So execute it. And here you can see we have a loading state, then this success state, hello Himanshu. By using this approach, you can use dependency injection in your project. Now we are going to see scopes in Koin DI. So what do you mean by scope? Well, scope is something under which you can create your class objects that is only injectable within a certain scope. Like if you want to inject something in your main activity, you can create a scope for your main activity, and your object is now only injectable in your main activity. You cannot perform DI with the same object in other place. You can only inject that object in your main activity. Let's see how you can do it. So for that, go to your UI module, and here I'm going to create a data class, and the data class name is session manager. We have variable here naming session, type is string. Okay, now it's time to create one more module. That module name is session module. I'm using here module DSL. Now if you want to create a certain scope, you can use here scope DSL, and in this we have to mention the scope. So for me, I want to inject this object only in my main activity, so simply use here main activity. Now in this you can use factory, you can use scoped. So I'm using here scoped, and in its scope I'm gonna show him the way to create my object. So session manager, in place of session I will call it this is session. That's all. Now go to your base application, and here register your session module. Come back to your main activity. Now because I want to inject session manager only in my main activity, so in order to do that, first you have to use here one interface, and the interface name is Android scope component. Now this Android scope component interface contains two different things, the scope variable and on close scope. So scope is actually used to determine the scope, and second function is on close scope, which actually used to free up the memory. So we'll call this thing in our on destroy lifecycle event. Now come back to your main activity and initialize this scope first. So use here control I, enter, remove this get. I'm using here activity scope to initialize my scope. Well, if you open my activity scope, in this first thing first, it is an extension over component activity, and we have here two different way of creating my scope, which is activity scope and activity retain scope. The main difference between these two are activity retain scope will eventually survive the configuration change, but activity scope won't. So if you want to use this one, you can do it very easily by using activity retain scope, but for my case I'm using activity scope. Now come back to your main activity, and now it's time to perform the injection. So private val session manager, type of this thing is session manager, just use here inject. Let's see whether it is initialized or not. So to see that, in the greeting I am simply adding its session, and in our on destroy event I will call on close scope. Let's re-execute our application. Yeah, it works. Now it's time to see custom scope. Suppose you want to create a custom scope for yourself. How can you do it? Well, it's very easy. Go back to your UI module. So for that, first I'm gonna create one more data class, and the data class name is user, that has name, and just below to it I'm gonna define my user scope. So here we'll use a named qualifier. Non-named qualifier is actually used to make the differentiator between the same kind of objects. So we will see later how you can use named qualifier, but for the time being we'll see about custom scope. Now in this name I'm using user scope. Okay, it's time to create one more module naming user module. By the way, you can use the same custom scope thing in this session module, but in order to show you more clearly, I'm going to create one more module DSL. Now it's time to define our scope, and in this scope, this time my scope is custom, which is user scope, and I want to create user type of object. Now in its name, I'm using my last name, which is Gaur. It's time to register this user module in our Koin. Let's do that. Come back to your main activity, and now it's time to perform dependency injection. So I'm using here two different things: private let init variable, user scope. Type of this thing is scope. Next we have private let init variable user that will want to inject. Okay, so first thing first, we have to initialize our scope. So for that, in our on create, I'm using user scope and initialize this thing with get coin. Make sure to use non-composable get coin, create scope, and in this, if you see the input type or parameters of this function, we do have to pass scope id. So let's here scope underscore id. Next, the custom scope, which is user scope. Now we initialize our user scope. It's time to perform injection. So for that, I want to initialize my user. With the help of user scope, I will perform injection. So use here get, because right now we are in the on create. So due to that reason, I'm using here get. So it will initialize my user. Now it's time to use our user. Remove this session manager thing. Use your user dot name. Execute our application. And lastly, once you're done with this thing, you can simply close everything in your on destroy. So user scope dot close. Alright, so here you can see hello Himanshu. Now Himanshu is coming from this name, and Gaur is my last name that is coming from my user. So by using this approach, you can perform custom scopes dependency injection in your main activity or anywhere else. Now lastly, we'll see how you can use a named qualifier. So for that, go to your UI module, and in our UI module, I'm gonna create factory. Okay, now this factory eventually return a type of string, and here we have first string. Similarly, we have one more factory, and the type of this thing is string, and in its we want to return second string. Now here you can see we have two different factory that has the same type, which is string. Now if we want to inject a string, our Koin DI will confuse which string you want, because it has two different implementation to create string. Now if you want to use the same object type in your Koin dependency injection framework to inject dependency, on that case you have to use here a named qualifier. So first, now it will make difference by using this qualifier. Similarly, if you want to inject the second one, again use name and call it second. It's time to perform injection. Go back to your main activity and let's see whether it is possible or not. So in our main activity, at the bottom, I'm gonna create here two things. First string, type of this thing is string. Okay, now inject it. You can see over here, okay, the type is string, and here you can pass the qualifier. So use here named, because it's a first string, use first. Duplicate this thing, rename the first to second, and just change the qualifier from first to second. Just use first string and second string over here. Remove this username plus first string plus second string. Just re-execute our application. You can see over here, hello Himanshu, first string, second string. Now if you remove this thing, this qualifier, let's see what happens. And in our main activity, on the top, remove these qualifiers. Okay, if you want to execute this application, you have a problem. You can see over here, this time we'll receive second string, because our Koin dependency injection is not able to make differentiator between first string and a second string. So if you want to make differentiator, you can use a named qualifier. So yeah, that's it for this video. I hope I'll tell you everything that you should know about Koin Dependency Injection framework. If you like this video, subscribe my channel and also do contribute me. Link present in the description box. We'll meet in our next video where we'll discuss something new about Android. Till that, goodbye.